So, The Man He Killed was written by Thomas Hardy, and the gist of the poem is that it's about a soldier kind of reflecting upon an enemy that he's killed and really considering their similarities in a way that we don't really usually hear soldiers talk. He's reflecting on the ways in which they're actually quite similar human beings and could have been friends in a context outside of war. So by doing that, what Thomas Hardy's doing is questioning the whole concept of war and trying to emphasise the humanity that's on both sides of any conflict. In the exam, it's good to talk about context. So we know this was written during the Boer War in 1902, and so Thomas Hardy would have been aware of the British soldiers who were in South Africa at the time, fighting over resources and over gold. What's interesting is that actually the poem doesn't mention that at all. It doesn't make reference to any particular war, and even the language that it uses is quite universal. It doesn't feel trapped in history or anything. So what that means is that contextually you can kind of apply this to any war. I think Thomas Hardy might have done this on purpose. He begins the poem talking about an ancient inn. So he's casting your mind throughout history, to the ancient times, even to the modern times, and trying to get you to think a little bit about war, and really how the situation he's describing could apply to any situation of any war in history. So let's read the poem, and then I'm going to take you through some interesting techniques that Thomas Hardy's using. It goes like this. The first thing I ask you to notice is just see it's all written in speech marks. So we've got these kind of punctuations here that kind of suggest it's not Thomas Hardy speaking, it's maybe a soldier speaking, or he's quoting someone that he's heard. So here's how it goes. It says, "Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin. But ranged as infantry, and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me, and killed him in his place. I shot him dead because he was my foe. Just so, my foe, of course he was. That's clear enough. Although he thought he'd list, perhaps, off-hand like, just as I was out of work, had sold his traps, no other reason why. Yes, quaint and curious war is. You shoot a fellow down, you'd treat if met where any bar is, or help to half a crown." So let's look through that poem a little bit. It starts with this idea of if they'd only met in an inn, in a pub, if they'd only met that way, they could have been friends, they could have drank together. And I always find it interesting that he starts with this image of an ancient inn. Firstly, like I've said, it's because it's ancient, it kind of casts your mind throughout history and it gets you to think about all the relevant situations this could apply to. But also an inn is a place where people meet socially, where people drink, where they can relax, where they can just hang out with their friends. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons he's chosen that imagery or that setting, is to get us to consider some of those connotations of friendship that are throughout the poem. When he mentions that, he talks about a nipperkin. That's a small portion of beer, one of the smallest you can order. And he said they would have drank many of those, so they would have got very drunk together. It's interesting that he says nipperkin. It's not a common word. It's almost a colloquialism. It's like a local word or slang that you might use in those times. And so it's not a very formal poem like some of the others. It's not trying to be upper class and complex. In a way, it's using quite ordinary language, almost relatable language, quite social language that you'd use at a pub. When he mentions killing the soldier, he says they were ranged as infantry and staring face to face. That repetition is interesting, face to face. An interesting phrase is used there. What I find intriguing about that is that he's used the same word, face, to describe his face and the enemy's face. You know, he could have used the more negative word if he felt negatively towards the enemy, or he could have used a more positive word to describe himself. But using the same word almost creates like a mirror image. In fact, it makes them perfectly equal. There's no difference between them. There's one face and another human face, and it's almost like they're looking into a mirror. So I found that a really effective piece of repetition. After that, he tries to explain why he shot the man. He says he shot him dead because, because he was my foe. It's interesting the hyphen there because it's almost like he's hesitating. I get the sense that the speaker isn't really sure why they've killed the man. The hesitation would maybe imply they're not sure what the purpose was of the war. They're kind of trying to convince themselves. And then you hear him say, "Just so, my foe, of course he was." That's clear enough. You know, he's almost reiterating it to himself as if it's not obvious, actually. He has to say it. He has to repeat it to himself. "Ah, that's why I've killed him. He was my enemy." And what does that mean, that word, foe, enemy? You know, without context, there's no reason why he would have killed him. He just convinced himself, or had to convince himself, that in the context of war, that's what he had to do. The last thing I've noticed about the poem, structurally, you'll notice the rhyme. Met, in, wetkin, infantry, face, me, place, because, foe, was, or though. That's kind of an interesting, but quite a simple rhyme scheme. In some of the other poems, like Exposure, you've got a very complex, almost half-rhyming, lack of rhyming, free verse style. And the effect of that normally is if you don't have rhymes, it kind of expresses the chaotic feelings, the lack of structure in what someone's feeling. Here we haven't got that. Here the rhymes are almost quite straightforward. They're quite simple. They're quite easy. The kind of rhymes you get in a nursery rhyme. And I think it's interesting that Thomas Hardy chose then to use maybe a bit of a childish rhyme scheme, a simple rhyme scheme. He's not trying to overcomplicate this scenario. He's maybe saying that what the speaker's saying is quite simple. It's quite straightforward. It's quite a simple fact, really, that we all have to contend with. That when you shoot someone, you're shooting someone who could be quite like yourself. That's not a complicated thought. It's quite a simple truth. And therefore, it really brings home the message of the poem. That it's a simple human truth that they share. You know, it doesn't take an intellectual to work this out. Also interesting because often when you get nursery rhymes or you get a simple rhyme scheme, it kind of shows a confidence on the speaker's part. This speaker does seem confident, but then that confidence is knocked in the middle when he's trying to explain why he's killed the enemy, and he can't really do it. So, let's finally think about what poems you compare this to. 3 that I've chosen are poems where there's another encounter between a man and someone who he's supposed to be an enemy of. So in the poem Sennacherib, we get a very clear distinction between the Syrian army and the Jewish army, and the town of Judea. And so in that poem, Sennacherib, you get the description of the enemy in quite a violent sense. They're described as like a wolf. That's very, very different to the man he killed. In the man he killed, the enemy is humanised, not turned into some sort of animal or dehumanised. It's the same in Charge of the Light Brigade. We get the description of the honour and the respect and the brave charge that the soldiers made. In the man he killed, I'm not sure there is that sense of bravery, because he's questioning the situation. He's trying to wonder why he's done this. Doesn't describe the fighting really at all, apart from standing face to face. Whereas in Charge of the Light Brigade, you get very brave descriptions of the battle, the sabres and the cannons. Likewise, in War Photographer, you've got a situation where someone's reflecting on a war that they were involved with. They were a soldier, but they were a photographer, and describing someone who died. In that poem, it's the mother and child who were separated as the bomb hit. In this poem, it's the enemy soldier that we're hearing the description of. But in both, I think the speaker's kind of reflecting, recognising the humanity of the situation, how war itself doesn't allow them to be human. But in the poem, they're kind of recognising their shared humanity. So have a think, try and make a plan, and have a practice of writing some sort of essay comparing the man he killed with one other poem. That'll be good practice, getting ready for your exam. Good luck.